you're very passionate about your teaching. It's obvious that you love what you do. What called you to that, John? Do you know at what point you knew that this was what was going to be your life work or ministry?
Well, there are two different ways to answer that. One was being called into ministry, and that was as a young guy who was trying to figure out what I was going to do ultimately for college. And in my mind, I thought that I was going to be a high school science teacher. I love science. I actually got a perfect score on the ACT in science, and that's really what I thought that God wanted me to do, to use the giftings that He had given to me. I ended up through what some people would say circumstances. Some people would say the leading of God. I tend to fall in that camp. Ended up at a Bible college as opposed to the University of Arizona, where I was planning on going. And so in talking with a counselor, an advisor there, really decided that the same things that I saw that were leading me to want to be a high school teacher, I could use as a youth pastor. And so my idea about being in ministry was never to be a senior pastor, never to be a lead pastor. In fact, people would ask me, do you want to be a lead pastor? And I'd say no, because if I'm a lead pastor, I have to put up with guys like me, you know, and I don't want that headache. And so I set that aside. I wasn't planning on doing that at all. There was a time, it was a little bit of a transition at a church I was serving in, where a senior pastor had retired. I was serving as a college pastor, and as our senior pastor retired, and there was a little bit of a protracted interim time, I was asked to do some different things. And one of those was to work with like real grown-ups. And I recognized how much I loved it. And then secondly, just as we were walking through this time and maybe wandered a little through that interim, it really made me think more about leadership and what that looks like in a church setting. And then thirdly, I had just an incredibly formative conversation with another guy on staff at that church. And it really colors what you see on the platform every Sunday here, which is he worked with singles and evangelism at our church, was an amazing speaker. I loved it when Rob would preach. And we went to a little one-day conference with John Piper together in Phoenix. We drove out. Rob drove his little, it was a Geo Tracker. He always called it an SUV, even though it was like this big. And we drove there, and then we were driving back, and I had preached that Sunday evening, so just the day before. And I took a little bit of a risk, and I asked Rob what I thought, or what he thought of my preaching. And he said, it was a risk because one, he was an amazing speaker, like I said, and two, he was super sarcastic. And so it's like, who knows what Rob is going to say? And he said, John, I'm glad you asked, because when you preach, the content is great, and I love all the things that you say, but I don't feel like there's any passion there. And I never get the feeling that you think what you're saying is important. And it really made me think through like what it means to preach and what it means to actually communicate the Word of God, how important that is, what an incredible privilege it is, and the things that God can do through it. And so what you see on Sunday morning, I think is almost a direct reflection of that conversation that happened about 9 years ago on a freeway in Phoenix. And I've been thankful for that ever since, and have shared that conversation. I shared it with one of the guys here on staff just to help him to understand. how we get better at preaching and about communicating the word, and that we recognize we can't just get up and say stuff. We have to get up and say important stuff. And God's given us that. And it's our privilege then to unpack it so that God's people look a little more like him when they leave. And that's what we hope for.